I will start with an introduction to INTERDEM Academy, for those of you who don't know us yet and what we are. Then we will go to a presentation of case examples by Professor Frans Verhey. We will have an introduction to research ethics by ethical expert Dr. Dorothee Horstkötter. And then we will also have a pre-recorded talk by Dr. Bart Penders, the head of the Department of Maastricht University of Ethics. And then in the end, there will be time for discussion and Q&A. First, a little bit of background about INTERDEM Academy. You have probably all have heard about INTERDEM, which is an European network of senior researchers who all work on psychosocial interventions and early diagnosis of dementia. But then in 2014, we have started the INTERDEM Academy, which is actually for the junior researchers of INTERDEM, so you. What do we do? Well, we focus on career development, we organize training and network events, and we try to help you to adopt senior roles in the future. The INTERDEM Academy, as I told already, has started in January 2014. We have around 200 members all over the world. As you see, most of our members are based in Europe, actually in the UK, but we also have members now in China, Australia, Argentina and Brazil. So we're all over the world. We have first some different activities. At first, we organize masterclasses and summer schools for our members about topics about career development, methodologically, and other topics you indicate to us you find interesting. We kind of have two different educational programs. We have activities which are more focused on our early stage PhD students and activities who are more focused on our late stage PhD students and postdocs. We have an annual INTERDEM session during the Alzheimer Europe conference, which is actually the session you're joining now today. And yeah, we very kindly get this opportunity to have a masterclass for you every year. So thanks to Alzheimer Europe. And we also organize 2-day masterclasses in close collaboration with Distinct. Distinct is an ITN of 15 early stage researchers. They all work on dementia and technology, and they have summer schools and winter schools every year. And then we combine this with a masterclass for INTERDEM Academy members. We also have a travel fellowship, normally twice a year, in which you can apply for, and then you can visit another INTERDEM center to exchange knowledge, to work on a project together, and to work on your network. But unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 situation this year in March and also now in September, we thought, yeah, this is not the time to open the call for fellowships. So we unfortunately had to postpone it, but we're working now on an alternative, and we hope to open the fellowships again next year. To learn about our upcoming activities, you can always have a look at the website of INTERDEM, which you keep up to date with all of our masterclasses and events. We hope to continue our training activities now mainly online. And as I already said, the travel fellowship has been postponed for now, but we're working on an alternative. We want to implement an annual publication award in which we kind of provide you with a platform to inform each other about your results. And we will also have a nice prize for, best article. We also have an INTERDEM Academy advisory board, which is kind of mixing members. If you are interested to think with us about topics you would like to see in our future masterclasses, and when you also would like to be part of, for instance, the jury of the publication award, you can send an email to our INTERDEM masterclass email. Also, this is a call, of course, for new members. If you're not a member yet, what are our criteria? Well, first, are you involved in psychosocial research about dementia, which is our global topic? Do you consider yourself a junior researcher, which is mostly PhD students and postdocs? But if you have another function, but you still consider yourself a junior researcher, you're also very welcome to attend. Are you related to or supervised by an INTERDEM member? If you're not, you can still become a member of INTERDEM Academy. You're just not eligible for all of our activities like the fellowship, but you can still become a member. To become a member, you can send an email to the INTERDEM Masterclass email address, which you can see now on the screen. Then to get back of today's session, we will start with an introduction by Professor Frans Verhey, who will present 3 case examples to you. Professor Frans Verhey is a neuropsychiatrist and the head of the Alzheimer Centrum Limburg and the Memory Clinic. He is also a member of the INTERDEM board and the lead of INTERDEM Academy. So you have seen his name probably more often. Then we're very delighted to have Dr. Dorothee Horstkötter with us, who is an ethics expert. She works at the Department of Health, Ethics and Society. She's a researcher in mental health and neuroscience, and she's also a member of the Medical Ethical Committee of our university hospital. Then we will also have a contribution of Dr. Bart Penders, the head of the Department of Health, Ethics and Society. His research deals with scientific collaboration with a focus on biomedicine and nutrition science. And today he has prepared a talk about research integrity for you. You've probably, if you have seen our abstract previously, at first we had the idea to play the dilemma game with you today, which is an interactive game in which you can discuss with your fellow researchers about ethical dilemmas. Unfortunately, this was difficult to realize because we're all online. We weren't sure whether we could see you and work in breakout rooms. So we have decided to organize a follow-up session after this. So today we will provide you with more of an introduction to the topic of ethics. And then in the end of the year, INTERDEM Academy will organize another masterclass online, in which you can join and we will play the dilemma game. We will give priority to the people who are attending our masterclass today. So if you send me an email to the INTERDEM masterclass email with your name, I will give you priority and inform you as soon as possible as we have a date for this next INTERDEM masterclass. I want to show you a quick video about the Dilemma Game app. It used to be a card game which you could play, but last month, the researchers at the Erasmus University Rotterdam made an app out of it, so you can already play it at home. It's 2 minutes. I hope it works with the sound.
In an increasingly complex world of research, researchers are often confronted with moral dilemmas. It can be difficult to start a conversation about such delicate issues relating to professionalism and integrity in research. By confronting you with thought-provoking dilemmas, the Dilemma Game app aims to support you in further developing your own moral compass and discussing this kind of issues with others. Every month, a new dilemma will be uploaded. You will be able to vote on your preferred course of action, after which you get to see how others voted. You will also be able to see an integrity expert review comment that gives you an in-depth analysis of the dilemma and the underlying principles. Besides voting on dilemmas, you will also have the chance to submit your own dilemma. In this way, you will get feedback on your own dilemma from the research community. Discussing integrity dilemmas works best when done face-to-face. Therefore, the Dilemma Game app has a group mode. Simply create a room, select specific dilemmas to discuss together, share the code with the other players, and start discussing dilemmas that are relevant to you. After playing, you will get an overview with insightful statistics. For larger groups, the game also contains a lecture mode. In this mode, all individuals in the audience can join the game room made by the lecturer. Subsequently, everyone can vote, and the lecturer can show the percentage of votes per option. We at Erasmus University Rotterdam believe the Dilemma Game can help you as a researcher in your day-to-day work. Download the app now and start challenging your moral compass on your own, in your class, or together with your peers and colleagues.
Okay, this was about the app to already play the Dilemma Game. It's it's fun to do. So if you want to download it, please go ahead. You can see the link below. And actually, that was everything I wanted to tell you. I would like now to hand over the word to Professor Frans Verhey, who will start with an introduction by presenting 3 case examples to you.
Thank you, Fania, for this nice introduction. It's really pity that we do not have the opportunity to play the dilemma game now, but I think we will have soon. We will organize the next session because it's really fun, like Fania said already, and also very insightful to discuss this with each other. And so we will present. I think you can see this slide here. Just to warm you up, we will discuss, or not discuss now, but I will just present 3 ethical dilemmas that occurred to our practice in the last weeks. I think it's very informative and also illustrates also the practical sides of these ethical dilemmas. The first one is, let me introduce, this is Peter. He's very active and very healthy man. His mother had severe dementia at old age. He was admitted to a nursing home, he remembers well. And he's participating in an epidemiological study into risk factors, general risk factors about cognitive aging. And in this study, particularly also the gene profile, ApoE gene profile is being tested. And we know that a specific gene, the ApoE4 subtype, the allele, increases your risk for developing AD. But this is a very general risk increase. He knows that ApoE gene has been tested. He wants to know about the results. So what is my ApoE4 profile? But in principle, this information is not shared by the researchers. As I said, he had no meaning for the individual participants. So this is about what can you share, what can you not share, and what is, why are you doing this actually, or what is the background information that can be shared or not. Okay. We have a second case. His name is Gordon. He's, I think, 74 years old. He's becoming increasingly forgetful, and his wife is really concerned that he might have Alzheimer's. But he doesn't want to go to a memory service. He don't want to have a diagnosis. He fears that a diagnosis will change his life practically in terms of self-image and relationships. But his wife wants him to get into a university memory center, and then she hopes that he can participate in the trial for which he can benefit. So this is about conflicting interests. And we have a third case. She's a 70-year-old woman. Her name is Caroline. She's been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. She got all the assessment, including biomarkers, and it was positive. So it's probably prodromal Alzheimer's disease. And a doctor told her that he can offer some psychological support, case management, but there is no medication presently. And he mentioned there might be a very promising drug. He wrote he read in the newspaper, but only that means that in the context of 18 months RCT, and he has to send her to University Alzheimer Center, where she can participate maybe in a trial. So this is about the therapeutic illusion. So is he doing an RCT also actually benefit? Does a patient benefit from participating in a trial? So 3 cases to warm up. The next, I think we can start later the discussion, but it's just so what kind of problems can you encounter? And I hand now the mic to Dorothee, and she will present about the ethical dilemmas. Dorothee?
Yes. Hello. So, okay. So yeah, hello everybody, and I would like to continue with the discussion to provide you with profound backgrounds on how to discuss cases like this which had been presented by Frans Verhey a minute ago. And in order to do that, I would like to give you a general introduction into the background of research ethics. I think research ethics is something that you encounter in your daily life as a researcher as soon as it comes to ethical application in research ethical committees. But I'm not going to dig into those details. I'm not going to dig into the details of regulations, but I would like to present to you more from a philosophical point of view, well, the ins and outs and the whys of research ethics, and also why there are which ethical challenges there are and which ethical dilemmas there are, and why. So when I do that, as in my background of being a philosopher and ethicist interested in issues in mental health and neuroscience. So I started with bringing you an overview of the table of contents from a Alzheimer Europe report, actually, the ethics of dementia research, which has been issued in 2011. And I think it's, but I took 4 points from this table of contents, which I think these are, why these 4 points are important for doing good research, good dementia research, but also maybe also other kind of research, but that's not our business today. So one is involving people with dementia, ethical issues on that, informed consent dementia research, protecting the well-being of people involved in dementia research, so when people are already participants, and issues on risk, benefit, burden, and paternalism. And I would like, in the upcoming 20 minutes, I would like to present to you also the more general background on how come that these 4 issues are so prominently discussed also in the Alzheimer Europe report. And I would like to do that very starting from the beginning and proceeding step by step. And the beginning of research ethics, of course, is a question on what is ethics. And very generally, of course, ethics is the issue on, well, what is good? What do we ought to do? And ethics on doing good always is about our relationship to other people. And in research ethics, we are mainly talking about relationships from a researcher with research participants. In the second lecture of today, we will more focusedly in research integrity, which mainly focuses on the relationship that the researcher has with other researchers and with the wider public. So that's, I think, the main difference between research ethics and research integrity, the focus on which relationship to somebody else are you talking about. Okay, so you're talking about ethics, what is good. I think ethics very generally concerns our norms and our values, and I think there's an important difference, and that has an impact on how we talk about research ethics. First of all, the norms that are specified, our rules, agreements, guidelines, principles, our regulations on what we should do, put down in different kinds of guidelines and declarations that we know in research ethics. But all these norms are based on values. Now, what then are values? Values are more broad, more fundamental. Values are about what we think is worthwhile, what we think is important to achieve in our lives. If I tell this to students, the frequent reactions were, well, that's so vague. What should I do about this? How can I measure this? Well, the thing, of course, is you cannot. Ethical statements, values cannot be tested objectively as either being true or untrue. You cannot measure it, whether you think this is worthwhile or not, whether it's true that a certain worthwhile or a certain goal is worthwhile. Instead, ethical just statements must be justified. You must develop a reasonable argument why you think that something is worthwhile. And we see back in a minute why this is important also in this context of research ethics. And I think there's an important relationship between our background in medical ethics. That's why I would, and particularly for those of you who are involved both in clinical work, care work, and in research, there might be a mismatch on how to treat whom and why. But I think the most important thing in medical ethics is to think about the ultimate goal of healthcare, and that is always to help the patient. The patient is the focus of whatever you do as a clinician. So you provide for safe and effective treatment, you inform patients about their health condition, about their possibilities on which treatment they could engage in. They take us in an equal part in the decision making, and they have the final say on which treatment to accept or to reject. And they also are the ones who may decide on the quality of the success that you yield with some support. So in a different sense, you could say in a clinical situation, the professional and the patient are in a subject-subject relationship where both have an equal say and where they have a dialogue with each other. In research ethics, when we do research and relate not to a patient, but relate to a participant, there's a fundamental basic difference. And the difference is that your aim, the main aim of the researcher, is not to help the patient in front of her, but it is to gain knowledge and thereby to help society and in the long run to help the group of patients, future patients, like the one that you conduct your research with. And this leads to a couple of complications of what it means to have a good relationship to the participant if your main goal is not to help him or her, but your main goal is to use her in order to gain knowledge. So you make sure that, so in order to be, as a researcher, you conduct research with social scientific relevance. You have the obligation to be methodologically sound, have an adequate sample size, and perform a study in due time. That's the features of a researcher. As a researcher, you also decide about the study setup, you decide about the procedures to be followed. And in case of randomization, it is not the participant who decides in which group he wants to join or not join, but it's the randomization procedure. And once in research, the patient does what the research requires, not what he or she would prefer him or herself. And it's not the participant who decides whether a research project has succeeded, but it's the researcher, whether the results are valid, whether the data is available. So in a certain sense, we could say in research, we have a subject-object relationship where you objectify the participant for the sake of knowledge gain. And that is a basically ethical challenge, because you make a difference, a principal difference between the researcher and the researched. And if we go back in our philosophical history, we see I think a lot of our thought on what good human relationships is go back to influential philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who stated it like as follows: never, if you want to be good, if you really want to be a good person, ethically speaking, and a good researcher, never treat people merely as a means to an end, but always also as ends in themselves. And this is quite challenging if we look back and what is the point of doing research. So according to Kant, would say that subject-object relationships would be never ethically justifiable. So how can we then be a good researcher, ethically speaking? If we go further in our philosophical history, I would like to show you a quote from Jürgen Habermas, who's a German philosopher, but he's still alive, it's more recent. He said, well, there can be subject-object relationships which are ethically justifiable, but they should be embedded in a subject-subject relationships for being ethically justifiable. So that's interesting to see what could that mean. How could I engage with a participant in a subject-subject relationship and still conduct a research where I use the participant as a means to the end of knowledge gain? So in order to be ethically justifiable, we should focus on subject-subject relationships also in health and dementia research. Okay, so that's a start of why is doing ethically good research so challenging, because of the different kinds of roles that you have as a researcher and as a participant has by being a participant. Okay, then how could we do good in research? What would that require? And let's go back to another question. The question not what is ethics, we had that, but the question, well, what are human beings? What does it require to do good to other human beings? And I would like to formulate this quite generally, quite basically, on 3 main characteristics. And please feel free to disagree and just let me know in the chat. The first thing is humans, by definition, all of us, who can and who do give themselves goals and try to achieve these. We want to do something with our life. We want to achieve something. We are able to consider certain things valuable. But we are not only mental beings, we are also physical beings. We are psychophysiological beings. We can experience pain, we can experience pleasure and relief. And finally, we are social beings, and we live in social communities. So we have to somehow organize our social life. And I think these basic characteristics of what a human being even is gives a reason to think about, well, what would be a principled idea on doing good to human beings according to these 3 characteristics. So in medical ethics, it says there are formulated 3 corresponding principles. In order to do justice to the fact that we are all self-determined people are giving ourselves goals, we think it's important to respect autonomy of other people. We also say, in order to do justice to the fact that we are psychophysiological beings, our patients are and our participants are, we should contribute to benefits, do good, do something, don't do harm to people, do something that they can benefit from. And the third thing is, well, if you're social beings, we somehow need a structure to organize our social life, and that structure we typically call justice. Sometimes I ask my students whether they disagree with me or not, does this make sense? And I ask them, well, are you against justice? And until now, never ever anybody spoke up and said, well, I am against justice. But of course, there's a lot of disagreement on how to fill in the details. The details are not for us today. Okay, but I think, so given the different kind of relationships that we in the medical setting and in the research setting, in research ethics, these 3 principles could be endangered because it is very difficult, if not impossible, to conduct good research if we have to respect the autonomy of our participants, and they would have a say in which treatment arm to go or not, as they would have to say in a clinical treatment session. So in medical research, these 3 principles can come under pressure. And how then still to respect the person as a participant, as a human being, and still conduct a research, which is methodologically sound and which is able to deliver valid results. So I think corresponding 3 ethical principles in research ethics is the principle of informed consent. If you cannot give people the option to choose themselves whether to go in treatment arm A into the control group, you at least are obliged to inform people that they take part in research, what the research is about, what the limitations and the possibilities are of taking part in the research, and ask them for their informed consent to take part in the project. The second is that as a researcher, you are obliged to provide a justification for why you think that any risks and burdens inflicted by your research upon participants, how that can be justified by the benefits. And the benefits in the research context are not benefits directed to the patient, but always benefits in the terms of gaining knowledge or social benefit. So here comes back the very first idea that I said, well, ethical statements need good arguments, need justification. Here you cannot measure something. You have to formulate an argument why you think the knowledge that I can gain is so worthwhile that I think this kind of risk and this amount of burden is justified. The third thing corresponding to the idea of justice is that you have to make clear why you choose which kind of participants. Is it really necessary for your research to involve people with severe dementia who don't have decision-making capacity anymore? Is that necessary? Isn't that necessary? And if so, why? And whom to invite for which kind of research? So if we now go back to the, I think we have a bit of a foundation to think, well, how can we understand the main points or 4 main points of the Alzheimer report? I think we can see a quite overlap between the theoretical part that I explained to you, even though the order is a different one. So the principle of informed consent, which conforms to the point 4 in of dementia research, sounds quite similar. The requirement of providing a justification of the proportionality of the risk burden versus the benefits, it corresponds very neatly to the point of risk benefit burden and paternalism in the Alzheimer Europe report. The issue on fair research participant selection corresponds very well with the whole topic on involving people with dementia. How to involve them, when to involve them. And the fifth one, and I thought it was quite interesting that the Alzheimer Europe report did not make really a difference between these different points. The protection of the well-being of people involved in dementia research. I think that's a very important one and corresponds to the idea that there's something difficult and problematic about, or not difficult and problematic, but different our relationship as a researcher to a participant as compared to a clinician with a patient. And that also means that caring for the well-being and respecting or embedding a subject-subject relationship in the broader subject-object relationships requires that you continue to care for participants' well-being even after the inclusion into a research project. So that also means that research ethics does not stop as soon as you have your ethical approval from the Medical Ethical Committee, but actually it then begins, because then your relationship with your participant only can start. And it requires you to continue to see your participants as first a human being and then a research participant. So far, I think that there's the ethical, the theoretical backgrounds on what it means to be an ethically good researcher, and what are the dilemmas and complications given this relationship, also compared to the relationship of a clinician. But I think sometimes you might also wonder, well, why are we so closely looked upon as researchers who mainly intend to do good, who want to gain knowledge for society, who want to provide society with better treatments, better treatment options, better interventions. And we see a reality in which researchers are very closely looked upon, where research scandals are easily coming into the newspapers, or at least as someone thinks, well, researchers, there's a misbehavior in researchers. Participants had been maltreated. And there's quite close and strict judicial procedures, so that according to which, with a research project, you have to, and in most countries you are obliged, also judicially obliged, to apply for ethical approval. A procedure which is very often experienced as being a hurdle to doing good research. Now I even say that with approval, your responsibility as a researcher starts, not ends. And I think there's also something that we should realize, just as a background information, that research with human beings, of course, has a long history. And the history is not only that good. And that gave at least rise to the development of a whole series of rules and regulations, and public and institutional attention to researchers. And let's say, I think, I'm not sure, history somewhere starts. I never exactly know where it should start. I think research ethics history, actually a formalized form of research ethics history, should start at the beginning of the 19th century in Prussia, wherever first regulation had been issued on a research ethical regulation had been issued, so about 120 years ago, requiring clinicians to at least inform their patients when they were applying a therapy which was experimental. Before the time, being a researcher or being a doctor, well, the roles were not that divided. it was not always clear to whether a certain situation was an experimental situation or something which would deserve the status of being a well-known treatment. And doctors had to kind of try something new without necessarily telling their patients. But the first Prussian regulation that did oblige doctors to tell patients if they were trying something new. This early Prussian regulation had been abandoned during the Nazi regime, and so that during the Nazi time in Germany, but also in Japan, very cruel experiments had been conducted on detainees of concentration camps, but also in Chinese prisoners. But these cruel experiments had two consequences for those involved, not for the participants. Many of them died. But the one is that after the Second World War, in the so-called Nuremberg doctors' trials, the doctors or the researchers responsible for the cruel experiments had been sentenced. It's quite severe sentences. But the second thing I think is also important to acknowledge, at the same moment, also a code of conduct was released, and which is now, I think, the most famous one, why I jump in here in history, the Code of Nuremberg, which made the first attempt, second attempt, to define a regulation on how to protect the rights of research participants. This is the Nuremberg the Nuremberg Code. I think it's more or less complete. It's not that very long, and it focuses mainly on the issue of voluntary consent. So the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Now that is specified in the next paragraph. I think the final paragraph is also interesting for us because I think that's a situation which has changed completely. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates direct stages in the experiment. So it rests upon the responsibility of the researcher. That led to a post-war history where there was still a quite loose dealing with research practices and dealing with research participants. So in 1964, the World Medical Association released the Declaration of Helsinki for several reasons. First of all, researchers said, well, the Nuremberg Code is so broad, we cannot really deal it. It does not guide our daily life. And the second thing, it focused very much on voluntary consent and the capacity to consent. But it did not say a word on risks that might be imposed on participants. So in principle, participants would be able to consent to very risky, maybe even deadly research practices. And that can be a problem, particularly with participants who are highly desperate because of their very severe condition, and who might tend to just accept everything that the researcher promises her or him to maybe relieve her condition. So in 1964, from the very beginning, the Declaration of Helsinki made also some very specific statements that there should be at least a favorable risk-benefit ratio, benefit in terms of knowledge gain, of course. And in 1975, learning from a history of continuing research misconduct, the declaration issued the requirement that we should not only trust researchers in doing the research in a good fashion, in an ethically good fashion, but there should also be an independent review before any experiment takes place. So since 1975, our international guideline requires researchers to have an independent review of the research protocol. So it's a bird's eye, I think, of our institutional review boards, medical ethical committees. And in the Netherlands, at least, and that's where I'm from, where I'm working, I just present you this example. This resulted another 30 years later, actually in 1998, in a judicial basis and in the national law, as a Research with Human Subject Act of the Dutch government. I'm not going into detail, but here you see it as a law which judicially formalizes and gives judicial force to the various research ethical regulations. So if we now go back to our cases, Now, let's go back. So now let's help you see the background on why do we have research ethics at all? What are the backgrounds from both a historical judicial perspective, but also more basically from the ethical challenges involved in research practices. And if we now go back to our 3 cases, and I would also like to ask Frans and Fania to join to the discussion. I think if we look to Peter's case, we could at least ask the question, well, should we respect his autonomy and provide him with his genetic status on the a priori risk status? Or should we protect him from unnecessary harm and withhold the information because we know that on an individual basis, it is not meaningful. And we might provide him with needless fear or needless despair. The second person, Gordon, well, we could wonder whether it's important to respect his autonomy, to not be diagnosed at all, or we should say we should maybe better safeguard his well-being by providing care, and care which depends on being diagnosed. We could also ask, well, does he still have decision-making capacity? Is he still autonomous? Is he still able to make these kind of decisions on diagnosis, but also decisions on participation in a trial? And apparently, you could also ask about the position of his wife. Does she really understand the goal of research? If she is motivated to involve her husband into research, or is she rather suffering from what we would call a therapeutic misconception? So the idea that by being involved in a trial, one is cared for as if one were a patient, but one is not, as we have now learned. And what about Corona? Should we safeguard her well-being and provide her with the best possible care in the center that she's involved with now? Or should we engage, or should she be engaged in a research study with a possible benefit of drug treatment, but also with a possible lack of benefit of the drug treatment, and a quite certain risk of losing the daily care, which she could only be provided in the care facility that she is involved with now? Okay, thank you very much. I think that was my my contribution for today. I would like to head over to the lecture on research integrity by Bart Penders. And for that end, I will again share my screen and show you the video. I hope, wait a moment.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this brief introduction to research integrity. I am speaking, as you can see, from my living room, and you are also, as far as I understand, watching and listening to this from your respective homes or offices. I've been invited to speak for only a few minutes, that's why it's a brief introduction, on research integrity. My name is Bart Penders. I work at Maastricht University at the Department of Health, Ethics and Society. And both in my research and in my teaching, I devote significant attention to the quality and integrity of research. And what I will be doing today is not list in detail all the various rules that we have and all the various guidelines that we have in the Netherlands to ensure that our research is of sufficient quality, both in terms of techniques and methods, or in terms of moral quality, the domain of research integrity. You are perfectly capable to look up those rules yourself. You probably know some of the documents in which they are written down. And many institutes, university hospitals, departments, faculties, universities, or other research institutes or treatment institutes tend to even have their own interpretations of these guidelines. Largely, they point in the same direction, but because of their minute differences, sometimes a little bit larger than minute, I will not go deeply into them, but instead talk about the underpinning and the origin of research integrity, why we have the rules that we have. And of course, that means that I will also speak a little bit about the rules themselves, but I will devote most of my attention to this background and context. So the first message that I would like to get across to you is that research integrity exists on multiple layers. That means that research integrity is an issue that involves individuals, what they do, as well as the places that they work. So we could speak of, my apologies, we could speak of research integrity as dealing with the actions that researchers take. How do they conduct themselves in the context of doing research? How do they do research properly? Which actions do they take? That is one layer of research integrity. The second one is, how do people internalize those the values and norms that we associate with research integrity and the actual rules that may exist on paper? How do they strive for themselves to become a good researcher? So it's not necessarily on the level of research actions, research activities, but on the level of an identity, a self-image of a researcher. And thirdly, and this is often the level of research integrity that is devoted the least attention to, whereas I would argue that it is the most important level. It is the infrastructural and cultural level of research integrity. How do we design our institutes, our universities, our hospitals, our research contexts in such a way that it is possible to do research properly, and that it is possible, or even stimulated, to internalize notions of research integrity. And on this level, things like incentives and rewards for specific types of behavior exist. What type of researcher do we want to employ, and how do we ensure that we stimulate people to work in a specific way? And these rewards and incentives can have many structures. You probably know this from your own employment. Incentives that reward a number of publication over the quality of the content of that publication, stimulates people to publish more, but not to publish better science, and as a result to conduct better science. And there are multiple of such examples out there. So all three layers matter. And for those of you who are in a leadership position, level 3 is something to focus on, and also something you can exert influence on. Whereas for most researchers who do sort of the grunt of the research labor, PhD students, postdocs, they tend to have little influence on level 3, on the level of structure, but at the same time are judged by the actions that they take as if it were individual failure, which it often is not. So we have in the Netherlands a quite recently revised code of conduct for research integrity. The year is on the cover here, 2018. And in 2018, it was largely rewritten. It's a brief document. For those of you who've never taken a look at it, click on the link. I'll show you the link in a minute, and take a look. It's quite accessible and quite clear. I will not show any sort of screen grabs or images of pages from it. What I want to share with you is the key set of values that are contained in this particular code of conduct. These values, and there are 5 of them, are forwarded formally by this code of conduct as the guiding values for research integrity in the Netherlands. They are honesty, scrupulousness, transparency, independence, and responsibility. Well, honesty speaks largely for itself. Scrupulousness has to do with the way you design and conduct research, in the sense that you commit yourself to using the proper methods, appropriate methods. Transparency, linked to notions of open science, is about showing what you have done in order for it to be able to be checked. That can extend to the point that you facilitate full replication, but it's also about making your decisions visible and giving account of the type of decisions that you've made. Independence, again, largely speaks for itself. Do science for science and not influenced by various other interest parties, whether commercial, whether financial, whether political, whether ideological. And the last one, responsibility, touches in some ways on research ethics, in the sense that it invites, well, actually forces researchers and institutes to take responsibility for the participants in their research. But it extends far beyond that, in the sense that it invites people to think about the relevance of their research and whether all the resources that they use for it are spent wisely. So where do these values come from? Because they make perfect sense, and if I were to ask you whether you would support them, you would probably say yes. But if I had not showed them to you, you might have come up with a different series of values that you feel constitutes the fabric, the moral fabric of science. And many of those, probably most of those, would have been perfectly appropriate. So why do we choose these 5? And the answer to that is actually quite banal, in the sense that it's just a choice. It's not that this is the only bit in terms of moral structure that matters for science. There is a lot more. For instance, an example, an older example, are these Mertonian norms for science. So the last report was from 2018. Mertonian norms were written in 1942. But if you look at them, the words are completely different. They still point in a similar direction for the moral structure for science. Communalism, also sometimes termed communism, but given that this was written in 1942 by an American, you can imagine that the word communism wasn't so easy to use at that time. But it points to the fact that science, as well as the output of science, should be common property and not for someone's individual advancement or wealth. Universalism points at access to science, in the sense that who you are, your gender, your wealth, where you were born, what your nationality is, what your race is, should not matter for your participation in science, as long as you stick to the rules, of course. Disinterestedness means, well, it does not mean that you should not be interested. It means that you should hold no other interests at heart than science itself. And the last one, organized skepticism, prescribes that one should be critical of any scientific claim and not simply accept it because someone says so. All, again, quite reasonable. But simultaneously, we do know that both these Mertonian norms, as well as this, the formal current view on research integrity, these 5 specific values, and that they are not always upheld, that it is actually, from time to time, quite difficult to uphold them, or even unclear what it would mean in practice to uphold them. But where do they come from? Where does this idea of that this is the proper way to do science, where does it come from? And it comes from essentially the birth of science. Science wasn't actually born in the 17th century. It's much older. As a species, the human race has been in pursuit of knowledge forever. And that pursuit of knowledge has been structured and has been given rules, and people have devoted professional time and careers to it for far longer than a few hundred years. But during the scientific revolution in 17th century England, something specifically changed about science that made it look like the cultural endeavor that we nowadays recognize as science. And the scientific revolution is mostly known, and you probably know, as the birth of the experiment, as a legitimate way to make knowledge in science. Whereas before the scientific revolution, it was more about observing creation out there, as opposed to interfering in it as a legitimate way of making knowledge. There was a big struggle about whether that was even the right way to do science. And for those of you really interested in that, take a look at A Social History of Truth, a book written by the historian Stephen Shapin, where he chronicles sort of the rise of this new way of making knowledge. What's interesting is the people in 18th century universities were mostly just schools where no or little research took place. The people were in a very specific social position, because they weren't employed by universities, but they still had laboratories and they still had a lot of time to actually do research, which meant that they had to be rich and had to have a lot of time. And in 17th century England, there were no tech millionaires or billionaires. The elite looked differently. The elite back then were those of noble born, those that were noble born. And nobility was, well, a largely, let's say it for what it is, a largely incestual crowd, a small group of people that knew each other and knew each other personally, knew of each other's characteristics and character personally. Regardless of whether or not they were actually doing experiments. And it is this idea of mutual trust and this origin of science as this ultimately elite activity that gave rise to the idea that scientists could be independent, that scientists could be impartial, that scientists in many ways did not have to benefit from the science that they were conducting, and also that they could be absolutely honest, because there were no social consequences for them. They were so rich, so powerful, so prestigious, so very much part of that 1%, and that they could not be touched. And this is essentially where these ideas of the independence and structure of science comes from. It's also problematic because, because science, and especially scientists, do not really look like that anymore. They are not so independent. They are not able to be so honest, because they have very worldly dependencies, like a job, a family, a house they have to pay for. And they are also not necessarily part of a prestigious elite anymore. Although most scientists are highly educated and are relatively well off compared to the rest of the population. If we take a look at these formal norms for science, or these reports, these codes of conduct, they exist so-called front stage of science, in front of a stage, and at the back of that stage is where the actual science takes place. Scientific publications are no different. They are sort of shown to the outside world, where they display a very stylized view of the work that actually took place backstage, where only a few people have access and only a few people have actually seen what really took place. If you uphold research integrity norms only front stage, only essentially for the viewers, but not in the actual practice, then it has very little value. Then ultimately, the problems that you create by doing so could seep through. And what sort of problems are we talking about? Well, there are a few things that are clearly wrong in terms of research integrity. And we call that research fraud or research misconduct. Plagiarism, falsification, fabrication. Plagiarism is when you take somebody's idea and don't credit them. It's not only about text. You can take somebody's ideas and use different words. So plagiarism is not only about text, that's copyright. Falsification is if you take, let's say, a data set and leave out a few things that do not fit what you would want it to look like. And fabrication goes beyond that and is about completely making up data and results. Everybody agrees that this is wrong, but most of the research integrity issues in science don't look like this. Of course it happens, and when it happens, it's big news. We all know Diederik Stapel, we all know examples of this in the Netherlands and outside. But most of the problems in science look like this. Things that are likely wrong, but we could talk about it. Questionable research practice. I'll give you the slides, and you can take a look at this list of potential questionable research practice that ranges from employing too many people on a project, turn a blind eye to somebody else breaching research integrity, not publish a negative study, and an inventory of these can be found, for instance, in this publication, but you can find many more elsewhere. It is these gray areas that where research integrity can make a huge difference, upholding the values that we just talked about, and of course many more, means that you also take position with respect to questionable research practices. This matters to science. This matters to the validity of research claims that scientists produce and that scientists also use, because science is always built upon new science. And if at some point one of the cards is pulled out of the house of cards, the whole thing falls together. But it's not only valuable to scientists among themselves. It is also, research integrity also has instrumental value in a way to uphold public trust and public credibility for science, and indirectly public support and ultimately resources for science. An example of this is that if we take a look at these statistics, this is the Eurobarometer, a questionnaire that's submitted to European citizens every 5 years, and occasionally, not always, they ask about whether or not we trust scientists. Between 2005 and 2010, as you can see in this table, in Germany is close to the bottom of the table, trust in science dropped enormously. Germans used to have, in 2005, almost the highest trust in scientists, and in 2010 it was almost the lowest, or the actual lowest. And in between 2005 and 2010, something happened in Germany with respect to research integrity. Some of you may know. The Minister of Defense, Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, had his PhD thesis revoked, his title taken away, and he had to resign as a minister in the first Merkel cabinet because it turned out that he plagiarized his thesis. And as a result, many other theses of prominent German politicians were examined in close detail, and some of these examinations came up with, well, not ideal results, so to say. This was a bit of a scandal, and it happened on the front pages of German newspapers for a few years. And the effects in terms of public trust in science are immediately visible. It's quite likely that this will bounce back, but it will take more time. It always takes more time to build trust than it takes to lose it. So, key take-home messages for this very short, concise introduction. Research integrity protects the process of knowledge making, and in that sense it's a little different from research ethics, but you've heard about that already. It has value internal to science in terms of protecting validity and credibility there, as well as external to science. It protects trust and credibility among the general population as well. And especially in times like these, this is a key resource that requires our attention. Front stage performances of integrity, essentially just faking it, is not necessarily any form of evidence for actual backstage behavior, as well as for backstage existence of support structures that allow people to live up to the values that we want all of them to live up to. And we can see that when scandals emerge and the curtain is essentially pulled back, and the messy practice of science becomes the topic of debate. So research integrity is something that has to be woven into the practice of science all the way into the backstage areas of knowledge production, laboratories, departments, meetings, bilateral individual meetings between scientists, and a lot more. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I can imagine that you may have some questions, so feel free to ask them after this lecture. Bye.
I hope that you could all hear both talks very well. I realized that sometimes that twice there was should be a little recording problem with the video. At least I got a sign that my recording was poor. I apologize for that, but I think there were only very minor parts that you might have missed. Sorry for that. So actually now the floor is open to you and for your questions that you may put into the chat, and questions may cover, even though Bart is not here with us today, I think questions may cover both lectures, and we'll do our best to provide you, to give you an answer or to give you an idea on how to proceed with that. Okay, yes, and now I open the chat, but also
looks like there aren't actually no questions. Yes, we have a question from Kate.
Do you see research ethics or research integrity as a higher order category? I'm not sure whether I understand the question well. Do you mean that the one would be superior or more important than the other one, or the one would be subsumed to the other one? Then I would say no. They exist in parallel to each other, because I tried to make sure clear in my part of the lecture, at least, in research ethics is about our relationship to participants as a researcher, whereas in research integrity, this is more about our relationship to our fellow researchers, to funders, and also to the wider public. So not one is subsumed under the other, even though there are there might be some overlaps, and Bart Penders indicated that when talking about the value of responsibility, that he said would also cover how to deal with research participants. But then it's also about, well, not mainly the focus, that is the responsibility that one has towards a participant, but that misconduct towards participants would also have impact on public trust and confidentiality from a public perspective. So while that route, you could say it is also subsumed, but actually I think it deals with two different kinds of relationships that you do have as a researcher. Okay.
Dorothee, I wondered, I think it was Bart to talk about doing research good and be a good researcher and organize this in a proper way. But also, I think it's also important for that there are, in fact, patients wanting to become engaged in research. If you do not have research, I think there won't be any development anymore. And I think if you need solutions, medical solutions, research is needed.
Absolutely,
So,
yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but do you think there's also a kind of duty for society to be engaged in, and how is this relationship between society and researchers?
You mean the other way around? If there would be,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
if it would be ethically justifiable to say that there's not the focus should not be in research ethics on protection of participants, as it is actually now the case, but rather on duty to take part in research.
In a way, yes.
I think that is an interesting issue, or whether it made sense to reorganize the whole business of research ethics and have a structure where people actually, because we all benefit from the results of research just by going to the doctor and getting whatever kind of medication, we all benefit. Do we also have a duty to all participate and support? But at the moment, that is not the case. But I think, to my mind, but that goes beyond what I upon in the lecture. To my mind, that makes sense under certain limitations. Limitations also having to do with the issue on fair subject selection, not always being the same people involved in research, having a variety of people involved in research, and also giving people at least a say in how risky or how burdensome research may be for them. And that depends a lot. How burdensome a research is not a fixed issue. It isn't fixed by the research project itself, but the burden inflicted by research can only be determined in correspondence to the social life or the actual life of a potential research participant. So what a 80-year single student can do in terms of burden is something completely different than a single mother of 3 can do, even though the health status is comparable, and from a researcher perspective, they would be equal. The burden would be completely different, and you cannot define that from a research perspective only. But now I also see some questions in the chat. I first read and then I react. But first to Marthe Schmedinger.
Yeah, I think we have to be really short because we're running out of
it's
time.
60. Okay.
So if you can give a quick response, maybe.
Self-building misconception, of course, is a very difficult one, because people tend to think that engaging in research will help them personally, and that's a failure, because engaging in research will help them if A, the research fulfills the hypothesis, and B, they are in the experimental group. So there's two preconditions that they indeed will be helped. I would say it can be a hard business to make this clear to participants, but research is not about helping patients. Research is about helping society. What are the thoughts on the code? The second, do I know if this decision was discussed with an ethical committee? Definitely not with an ethical research committee, because it was not a research question. And I don't know what, well, this closing of care homes was quite frequent in, I think, all over Europe, not only in the Netherlands. I'm not really informed about the backgrounds of these decisions, I have to admit. So that is beyond my expertise and beyond my knowledge. Maybe Frans or Fania can jump in. Okay, so the last question is a no, and the second question, I think that's a complicated one, and I could answer on a personal basis, but not based on research ethics.
Yeah. I'm afraid we really have to close the session now, because Alzheimer Europe has to continue with the next session. I think it's, shall we say, everyone, if you have any questions left, send them to the INTERDEM Masterclass email address, and I will make sure they get to Dorothee or Frans or Bart, and then you will get an extended answer from us. Yes. But yeah, sorry, time is running out, but I would really like to thank our speakers, Frans and Dorothee, and also Bart, who is now not with us. And thanks to you all for joining us for this seminar and for your input. And yeah, then I think this leaves me to wish you a nice conference and hope to see you at some of our future activities. So thanks a lot.